Welcome to our webinar. This is co-hosted between Equitable Origin and TDi Sustainability, and we'll be covering the topic of free, prior, and informed consent today. My name is Kaki. I'm the Standards Development Manager at Equitable Origin. So just to set the scene a little bit before I welcome today's speaker and talk about what's bringing us here today, I think many of us are probably aware that the global push for clean energy is really important for mitigating climate change. However, this rapid expansion of renewable energy projects and technologies has also increased demand for lots of things, including critical minerals, and it's really impacting Indigenous lands, cultures, and resources globally. There's a lot of research on this, but just one data point that I find really interesting is that 54% of all transition minerals needed for the clean energy transition are on or near Indigenous lands globally. So really potentially very impactful. So in the webinar, we're going to be exploring the intersect of Indigenous rights with free, prior, and informed consent. And we'll be looking at how companies can engage with the FPIC process responsibly. We'll be talking kind of a lot of different areas, but really discussing large-scale projects, some small-scale projects in extraction and development, and then innovative ways from our panelists on how to work with large and small extractive companies and projects. I'd like to welcome today's speakers. I'm pleased to be joined by our global panel with representation from speakers from the Canadian First Nations, U.S. tribes, and Ecuadorian Native peoples. So our first panelist is Yadira Okuwahe. Yadira is a member of the Equitable Origin Board and is the leader of the Secopai nationality. She's a women's leader of the Sequoia Remolino community, co-founder of Kenyao Enterprise, and Kenyao preserves the culture and autonomy of the nationality through the creation of ancestral ceramics. She integrates ancestral traditions and community-led initiatives to support protection of her territory, education, and sustainable development in the Amazon region. So welcome, Yadira. Next, we have Wayne Kaboni. Wayne is a First Nation person dedicated to social and economic development through incubating new Aboriginal businesses and offering ISO 19001 management system services and electronic business solutions. Wayne currently specializes as a venture catalyst, bringing financing opportunities with business partners and opportunities with First Nations in Canada and the US, including the development of business plans, quality management policies, and training. Welcome, Wayne. And last but not least, Daniel Cardenas. Daniel's a member of the Hamawi Band of the Pitt River Tribe of California, which is a federally recognized tribe in the US. And he served as a national elected, he served his community as an elected member of the Tribal Council. He's the CEO and chairman of the National Tribal Energy Association, and drives sustainable energy infrastructure development and advocates for tribal sovereignty and economic opportunities across Native American communities nationwide. Thank you all for being here. I'm excited to jump in. We'll just cover the agenda very quickly. We'll do a brief introduction of the topic. Again, this will be very kind of high level. I'd love, to jump into what it means on the ground and in implementation with the panelists during part of our panel discussion. And then we'll have time for some audience Q&A. We did receive a lot of questions through the registration process, so we're going to work through some of those. But if you do have questions during the session, please use the Q&A function to submit those, and we hope to get to them as well. But just to ensure that we're all starting from the same place, FPIC stands for free, prior, and informed consent. The right to FPIC is a key principle in international human rights law. It's established in international conventions like International Labour Organization Convention 169 and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it protects Indigenous peoples' livelihoods and territories and helps to ensure that communities have the right to give or withhold their consent to any projects that may impact their land, territories, resources, or cultural heritage. And this right is based in a broader right to self-determination. It's becoming it has become a legal requirement, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this in our panel, in many countries, but it's increasingly also a requirement for participation in other spaces like sustainability standards. It's important for financial institution funding at times, so it really is becoming a bit more mainstream. This just describes that EO and TDI have worked very closely together for nearly a decade to incorporate Indigenous rights into the work that we've done in the international standards and energy and mining spaces, working directly with clients and mining companies globally, and also in the renewable energy and international development spaces. We've worked with many, many different types of organizations. And notably, we might talk a little bit about this later, but we built a tool in collaboration with some Indigenous nations in the Amazon basin called the FPIC 360 tool, which is designed as a rights-based approach to multi-party engagement around FPIC. And it does include some digital tools, some training programs, and really helps to seek support for equitable, transparent, and verifiable free, prior, and informed consent processes. Just to touch a little bit more on the tool, it's founded on the premise that FPIC can only be conducted responsibly if Indigenous peoples who are affected by a project are co-owners, co-developers, and implementers of the entire process from beginning to end. And we'll explore that in more detail in today's webinar. I know it varies place to place, community to community. And so I think it'll be really helpful to understand what this means in practice from our panelists' point of view today. And by facilitating greater community involvement in and ownership of the FPIC process and its ongoing implementation, the tool seeks to help with documentation, support services, and really bringing everyone under kind of a common understanding of what needs to happen on the ground to make informed decisions, monitor ongoing implementation, and agree with different benefit sharing agreements and such. And then just wanted to acknowledge the work that TDI has done over the past years to engage with local communities and Indigenous groups in their work. The TDI Community Engagement Services have helped some organizations navigate this process while upholding legal regulations and respecting Indigenous rights. And so TDI has been a great partner for EO during this process as well. Yeah, I think we can, on that note, turn things over to our panel of speakers. And I'll start with Yadira. So Yadira, I would love to just jump into our questions and hear sort of what development opportunities and challenges is your community facing, and how does FPIC come into play in these relationships and decisions?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this space. It's an honor to be here. For us in our Equitable nation, we come from a millenary culture, one of the most smallest nations in the Amazon, with just 2,000 people between Ecuador and Peru. This condition makes us vulnerable. And industrial threat or deforestation put us at risk, existence at risk. Development opportunities that are proposed to our communities many times do not respect our forms of life side by side with the Amazon. Oh, today, for example, we are under threat by the palm oil industry that want to destroy our forest. Upon this, the women of Sequoia y Molino have decided to defend their forest by using ancestral pottery to protect 20,000 hectares of forest. FPIC is a right, is an essential but unknown right that is not recognized by the state. And that's why we want to strengthen this tool so we can decide upon our future with respect for our culture and life in the Amazon. We're done.
Thank you, Yadira. Yeah, that's, I think, really, really interesting I know you come from a very beautiful region. Um, I think a question we get often is how, because FPIC processes should be defined by Indigenous peoples, how can project proponents ensure that they're following the community's own protocols and decision making rather than imposing their own external process or external timeline on communities?
FPIC is a process in which indigenous people have to participate to include our perspectives before any decision that affects our territories. However, in practice, in my sea occupied territory, this process has never been applied correctly in reality. We have lived over 50 years in the presence of the oil industry in the Ecuadorian Amazon, and its legacy has been the destruction of the environment, contamination, and social disintegration. Decision has been imposed without any ethic process. In the last year, our nation has strengthened the internal organization and began to speak about consent and autodetermination and sovereignty upon this. As a result of this process, Sequoia Remolino community decided to preserve its forest, its culture, adopting international frameworks and internal agreements that prioritize life and sustainability. Give me please a minute to translate. I lost Yadira. So Yadira state the major challenge is that Ecuador, even though FPIC is recognized by the constitution, there's not a proper law that establishes how these rights should be applied in indigenous territories. In practice, institutions and enterprises do not respect the principle of good faith and they do not consult. They just go to communities and inform about activities that are already decided in small lobbies and the benefits that they will bring to the community. While if we don't make FPIC proper principles of FPIC be correctly implemented in communities, it will be impossible to guarantee a real participation in our traditional decision forms and our traditional way of seeing that life in their territory. Uh, and this will not be taken in account by companies or the state. It must be a continuous dialogue process of respect and trust, not just paperwork. That's the only way that FP will serve to ensure a proper development of indigenous people that comes from their own vision and from the perspective of indigenous rights.
I think we'll probably hear similar sentiments from our other panelists today as well. I did want to follow up just with a question about, has your community learned any lessons that you can share about benefit structures for projects that have come to your territory, or has it all been very challenging thus far? Are there any good examples?
Before it was a very hard to us. We've been living under the oil industry for 50 years. We had to adapt to the new reality. One of these cases is the Gartococha case, our ancestral territory. With, without a proper consultation process, our ancestral territory were given to another indigenous nation. But now, after many years of struggle and knowing the reality and ethnic rights, we've acted in a proper way upon law and the state. So the state responded to us. Also, young women are also learning and building capacities so they can know and enhance their rights as indigenous women and indigenous peoples of the Amazon. indigenous people in my community are studying so they can continue to defend their territory and know their rights.
I think that was a very landmark opportunity for your community to regain the legal rights of your land. So I think we'll circle back to that when we get to the Q&A. But I'd like to turn now to Daniel. So if I could ask Daniel to turn your camera on and microphone. I know we've previously spoken several times and recently on a podcast about the difference between consultation and consent and why that distinction is really critical for upholding Indigenous rights. So we had a great question that came up in the registration process about consultation fatigue and how to prevent consultation fatigue, where these processes are, designed to appear thorough. They maybe have a lot of meetings involved, but avoid the possibility of getting a no from Indigenous people. So it feels, kind of superficial. Do you have any learnings or thoughts on that process and how it's gone in your experience?
Well, the question goes to really what's most important from my perspective of FPIC. I mean, all of it's important, but to me, the most important is the information, the I in FPIC, because as a leader, without information, we can't make a self-determined decision. I mean, we can make a decision, but because if it's not informed, then for the most part, it most likely will be a wrong decision. And so, but that's the rub of many of our communities. There's 574 tribes in the U.S., and I can only speak to U.S. Indigenous peoples. Vast majority don't have resources that the corporations that the state and local governments do in academia. And so we're at a disadvantage already at the beginning at the table because we don't have the information. And primarily, we were missing the capacity to be able to properly engage. And so what happens when you're in an area where there's a lot of resources, not just mineral, but oil, gas, water, wind, solar for renewables. Tribes not just have consultation fatigue, but a lot of times there's too many developers coming in and trying to engage, and a tribe doesn't have the staff, doesn't have the resources or the time to be able to engage equally with each of them and do a really good job. And so that's another issue. And so the possibility of a no is real. But again, in the U.S. context, is a little bit different than what's happening in Canada or what's happening in the Amazon. Is tribes really have only control over their reservations. That's where they have direct control. So they can say no to a project that primarily affects the land that they own, that they have the title to. When we're talking about our ancestral territories, which are larger areas, legally, we actually don't have any authority to say no to a project. And so the process for us, to me, the way I sort of advise is we have to compromise. And I go back to our people, to our culture and our traditions of being very flexible. We call that we were dynamic in terms of and resilient, right? That's the key word now, is that, but we really were, right? When something happened, a flood, a drought, we moved, we changed, we weren't static. And so we need to remember that now when we're in these discussions with developers. We need to be resilient in terms of our thinking. It's not just trying to protect, because it's really difficult sometimes to explain. But a lot of our cultures have this dynamism built in, and so which we've not necessarily forgotten, but we tend to, as humans, draw a line in the sand and say, this is something that won't be crossed. And I think that in the long term, we need to think about those lines in the sands that we draw. What's the most important? What's not that there's something that's less important, but the reality in the U.S. is that critical minerals are right. Our president is in Asia and South Korea today, making deals on critical minerals and energy. But and most likely we're not part of that conversation. We're not part of the conversation. But as Americans, our resources, as you mentioned at the beginning, over 2/3 of the 4 top critical minerals in the U.S., copper, lithium, cobalt, and nickel, are on a reservation or within 35 miles of a reservation. And so it's very key to our future if we're going to develop our minerals. And so we have to be part of that. And tribes need to be cognizant of that. Is that the days of just saying no, I think don't really exist anymore. We've got to compromise so that so we all can move forward. But there's a lot more bigger issues sometimes than just us and our territories.
Thanks, Daniel. These are great points. I guess just to dig a little bit deeper into the U.S. context, we get questions a lot around, how do you ensure that the organization isn't corrupt, for lack of a better word, or speaking with the wrong leadership from Indigenous tribes in the U.S. So what advice do you have for companies who are maybe starting a new project and want to engage tribes in the U.S.? Where should they start? What are the most important things for them to keep in mind?
I think to obviously do your homework. You're doing your homework when you're talking about technology. You're doing your homework when you're talking about EPC contracts and construction and financing. If you're doing your homework, then there's no reason for you not to do your homework when you're talking about engagement, right? That's one of the excuses that I find moving forward, is that we don't know how, we don't have the resources. It's like you spent millions of dollars to do a FEED study. You can spend the same amount of money to engage. And so one is doing your homework. Two is, depending on where you're at, right? How we think in the U.S., how tribes think, is that every inch, every piece of soil in what is the U.S. is Indian country, even though technically it's not a reservation. It's not part of our we don't have any control. But most natives think that our ancestral territories still belong to us, and we still think about it in that term. And so most likely projects are going to be off reservation. And so what most developers will look at is what's the minimum that they have to do to get their project off the ground. What's the legal requirement? And so I would say go beyond the legal requirement. Do more than that you need to do. And that means doing your homework, but also means reaching out to those communities, because 2/3 on average, 2/3 of Native Americans don't live on a reservation. They live in the city. They live in Phoenix and Denver, LA, Bay Area, Chicago. They don't live on their reservation. So that means, what are the opportunities to communicate and engage with urban and suburban populations of our people versus the rural on reservation? And then there are tools, there are resources, like I said, at minimum, when they're doing their homework, to look at who are the government leaders, who are the proper elected officials of the tribes to go talk to, because that's where you would start. If your project is obviously on a reservation or very close, you should, as soon as possible, right? Even when your project's just conceived, or the inception of your project, talk to engage with those communities, because probably the initial engagement is going to be the most time consuming, right? But also this idea of consent and engagement is an ongoing process. And so to me, it starts when you conceive of a project, through development, through financing, through construction, through operation, and then once the lifetime of that project is over and you're in remediation and closure, it could be 4, 5, 6, 7 decades. And so the framework is that long. And so if so make the investment, look at engagement as an investment that you're making that's going to bring returns and dividends. Don't look at it as a cost. If you look at it as a cost, what do we do in our and within our budgets? We try to contain costs. And so obviously we don't have all the money in the world, and investment is also contained as well. But look at it. If you look at it differently, then you're going to reap those benefits with those communities. But I'd say that the top two things are: do your homework, do it early, and engage early as soon as possible, so that you can work with those communities on the conception of your project. Because a lot of times developers will come when it's already fully baked and ready to go, and then there's no room for changing. There's no room for tinkering with it to make the communities happy. And so that's when we get into conflict and confrontation. So do it as early as possible so that your project can change, so that it can incorporate the needs of those communities, and then you can have a project that's going to be a win-win for everybody.
Thanks, Daniel. There's a lot to unpack there still. I might wait to the panel or to the Q&A session to circle back on a couple of those points. But yeah, and then just to say, we'll be circulating some resources after the session. So for those of you who are looking for kind of where to go, we can circulate those afterwards. I'd like to invite Wayne up to turn your camera on, and I know you do work a lot with setting up and verifying kind of these best practices, these management systems, and I'm curious what information should be put in place to ensure that getting kind of into the nitty gritty here, but like what information shared with communities is really informed. What does informed mean? How do we ensure that it's accessible and objective and transparent in a way that really gets folks up to speed and is equitable?
The big thing is understanding the language, right? So when you're working with an Indigenous community, there's this notion that language is globally understood. So when you're talking to elders, when you use a word that, a word that talks about a place name that has significance, and I think Yadira talked about this a little bit, and when they're teaching language now, because it's a linguistic model, the language and the word means something different. And so when you're trying to understand what are the best practices in understanding why we talk about land stewardship, understand the significance. I was working with the Stolo Nation in the Lower Mainland that was talking about when the Trans Mountain Pipeline was, and they were trying to understand why the elders were so adamant about protecting this one watershed area. And, it was one word that meant something different to the person negotiating on behalf of the nation. But then a young person said, no, my granny said this, and this is what it means. So I think when you're talking about best practices, I think we have to have inclusion. I'm not a strong advocate of ownership of the OCAP principles of data sovereignty, because I was taught, and most Indigenous people have been taught, and some of the things that were shared with me with the Shuar in Ecuador, was that when we are shared information, when there's stories that are being shared with us, it's our responsibility and our obligation to ensure that history continues, and that we have a clear understanding of when we talk about, our traditional lands. In Canada, the notion is very different when we talk about traditional lands. Because when you're talking about treaties, as Daniel talked about, treaties only say that this is your land. So there's no significance around the understanding of traditional land holdings. So when you're talking about implications or advocating on behalf of nations, you need to talk about, one of the things that I work with nations is the time value of impacts. What does that mean? I was recently approached by an elder who's a residential school survivor, and said she had a grade 2 education. I said, well, you have a PhD in your Indigenous knowledge. You have a PhD in understanding the obligations you have to the land, your territory, and your people, and that's driven by language and your history. So when we're doing community engagement, you're talking about QA tools or quality assurance or continuous improvements, or corrective actions, we need to listen. And when you listen, you need to look at the time value of that lesson or that opportunity to hear what the Indigenous people are talking about. When we talk about water, we talk about the value of the water in Makas. When they're talking about some of the things that, a shore community, they talk about the canopy and the value of the canopy of the forest in terms of creating the medicines. And then they talk about the carpet, which is what's on the ground, and how that blends and how the properties of that are changing with the extractive industry, and no one's listening to why they want to protect areas. They're not saying no to development, but they're saying let's be informed about what that means. So when we talk about in Canada, there's been the misuse of the idea of FPIC. And, a lot of times it's misused by leaders of our communities. It's misused by professionals who work for our communities, with really understanding what that idea of free, prior, and informed consent means. And then you have these communities that have signed on to these processes or these institutes like the First Nations Management Board and the First Nations Financial Administrations Act and the Lands Act. What that does is that removes the idea, in a lot of cases, the idea of consultation with community members, because those pieces of legislation that you've signed on how to govern your communities changes the responsibility, obligation of consultation with community. And if we don't start to build capacity for communities, so proponents, as Daniel said, we invest in the feasibility studies. The one things that communities don't understand is the timeline of a project. So when you're talking about mining, what's the exploration process? What does that involve? What are the compromises or the things that we lose? What happens in the pre-feasibility stage in terms of raising capital? What are the obligations that are understood or recognized by the proponent or the Indigenous communities? What is what's the build process? So a mine project could last, from 25 years to 65 years, but the impacts are lasting longer than that. So when we talk about best practices, is communities need to understand what they're signing on to. What's the impacts, especially things like water, in terms of the environmental impacts. So when we talk about, the idea of towards sustainability is just towards sustainable mining or towards sustainable forestry, we're not talking about the global understanding of sustainability being a green implied statement. It's about sustaining an industry. And most of those validations or valuation processes are self-assessment. There is no engagement with Indigenous communities. Say, yes, you've done this good or you've done this bad. So when you're doing best practices, always keep communities informed, always understand the language of the land, always understand and respect the way people understand presentations. And sometimes it has to be, a process that's a living process, right? So we talk about living documents about being changed. Well, legislation is always perceived to be living as well, but we understand that FPIC has this really broad statement. And when mining companies are looking at expanding projects or extending mining contracts, FPIC is not part of that process. So that's where the idea of FPIC has been misused in my mind. I've been involved with mines that are pre-built, pre-engagement, post-engagement, existing. So it's an ongoing living process. And FPIC also talks about how do we internally within our communities consult with each other. What have we learned when we talk about, Yadira talked about, even the treaty obligations of overlaps on rights on land for hunting rights or water use. Water's become an issue with places like Shoal Lake and Saddle Lake and how that impacts their livelihoods and their culture. So I think best practices are something that's a living process. It's not a one and done. And it starts with honest communication, respect, and trust. Trust is the big issue. If it's what's the old saying, trust takes a lifetime to build, but takes 2 seconds to lose. And I think with Indigenous engagement, that's the reality of our space.
Yeah. I think those are some really key points in there. And just to touch again on sort of the the resourcing within communities. I know, especially in Canada, there are a lot of self-government agreements or Indigenous protocols that are in place, and I'm just curious where those maybe aren't fully formed or where there are still resource needs. And I think this probably ties a lot into your work. What are the best ways that, that we can be resourcing communities so that they can fully participate in an equitable way in the processes that they and the ways they would like to engage with communities around these projects? So maybe there's a lack of independent legal advice or technical expertise. These projects are extremely technical, or maybe they don't have governance and decision making, protocols set up all the way. So what are your thoughts, and how do you work with, resourcing communities to fully engage and participate with companies during this really complex, process?
I think one of the things that I've learned in my 40 years of doing the things that I've been doing, and most recently the last 20 years in the mining sector, is that the biggest barrier for communities is trust. Trust of the external proponents, trust in our leadership, trust in ourselves. And I think when we can talk about, I'm the bold guy who goes and trains communities on capacity. And one of the documents we were working on recently was a document around developing a code, and they talked about, oh, we want to talk about these values. What are our community values? What are our Indigenous values? And it was a code, a value code statement. I said, well, what is that? Well, no, it's that thing you feel in your heart. I said, but if you're going to challenge a proponent, you need to be able to document, and you need to have every component of your community understand what that means. So when you talk about the 7 grandfather teachings in the Anishinaabe culture, it means something different to different spectrums, right? When we talk about the 7 generations perspective on growth and development, there are different communities. And I got a lesson in Oneida when I was doing a book tour this August. Someone gave me a different interpretation of the 7 generations teachings about balance. So I think when we talk about processes around building capacity, is the first step we need to do is get communities to trust their judgment and their choices. And that requires them to have a clear understanding of what's on the table. What are the impacts to them as a people? What is the impacts to them to, elders, youth, men, women, culture, language? And once we get to that point and we can be informed about what's in front of us, and we can start to make choices that we trust because we're informed, consent is not an idea or a notion, it's a process, right? And that process requires trust of the proponent, and that requires that both parties, the proponent and communities, need to trust each other. So when something changes on the table, the other part that we don't talk about when we're talking about consent is government's impact, right? So, when we talk about the new Ecuadorian trade agreement between Canada and the United States, it talks about the idea of mining and forestry and all that stuff. But the Canadian government didn't include Indigenous communities in any of the writings that I can see in terms of how we do that. But it's a paramount principle that they push in Canada when it comes to, the processes of engagement in communities. And then we have United Nations declarations of rights of Indigenous people. But when we talk about UNDRIP, really no one understands where that started, where it began. And it began with the several Indigenous lawyers wanting to include Indigenous people in the conversations that impact them, whether it be land, language, children, youth, economic development. In order to understand what UNDRIP means, you need to understand its origins, why people started to have the conversations, why the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues became what it became. The other thing that people don't understand is there's other instruments like United Nations Global Compacts that talk about water, that talks about the rights of women, that talks about the environment, that talks about, these obligations. And they are understood and entrenched from the United Nations perspective. But as someone said earlier, and I think it was Danielle or Yadira, is that countries don't really follow those practices because there's no risk if they don't do it. And the rewards help them from a tax perspective. So the economics benefit government, but not Indigenous communities. I know when I was working with some of the shore people, they have land settlements or plots that they're given, and they started to sell that to proponents because, you know, they were doing artesian mining for gold, and that had lots of health impacts. So I think when we start to understand the history and we understand the language and what, you know, it's like when we talk about, in my language, mandakwe, it means something different today. You know, it means a hot chick. When I was growing up, in the language it means is when the aunties and the mom and the sisters give a girl her teachings of being a mother, of being a woman, of being a life carrier. And when we talk about water as life, you know, that has a different meaning for people, because people think about it as something you drink. Well, no, if you find the origins of what water means, it's where we all started, not just Indigenous people, all nations. We started in the womb, and the womb is governed by water. The attachment and the cadence of our life comes from the heartbeat that's carried through the water through the whole gestation period of life. So when we talk about best practices, we need to listen to what the Indigenous people are saying, because they're not saying no. They're saying, understand what we are saying so that we can come to something that makes sense for
Yeah,
both communities.
that's a beautiful way to put it. I really appreciate that. I think now maybe it would be great to ask Daniel to come back on video and we can turn to the Q&A. We have had a lot of questions in the chat, and way more, I think, than we can address. So I'm proposing that we will write some written responses and circulate those after the session. To start, I would love to pick up on a theme I think that has been touched on by all of our panelists. And I'd like to start with Yadira, about how, in your mind, FPIC can be really inclusive of folks within your community, whether it's women or youth or elders, and how to ensure that voices of folks aren't overlooked.
Institutions that are responsible to implement FPIC, they must have technical teams that understand Indigenous peoples and their culture. It's not just a legal framework. They must understand how our communities take decisions from our perspective and our traditional forms of organization. In case of the Equitable, decisions are based in the participation of all the community, not only on decisions taken by men. True consultancy must include the voices of women, youth, and older people, because each of these groups safeguards an essential part of collective wisdom. Furthermore, FPIC must respect our cultural times. They can impose, or companies can impose their times of days or weeks when these decisions require a lot of dialogue and spiritual reflection. This dialogue happens also during our yahe ceremonies and other community rituals. Finally, FPIC must take place in our own language. This will guarantee a real understanding and authentic consent. Only by doing this, FPIC will be really inclusive and will not only reflect the thoughts and the willingness, and will reflect the thoughts and willingness of all the people and not just a few representatives.
Yeah, thank you, Yadira. Wayne or Daniel, did you have anything to add here?
Can I just add to what Yadira had said, because I think it's as I mentioned, she has a good response, because it does. These processes have to include the community, but I go back and to challenge our communities to say, whose responsibility are some of these processes, right? I mean, for sure we should get the input of children and the youth and women and men and elders in those communities. But I'd say that because engagement through FPIC to me is a two-way street. If everybody just draws a line in the sand and says, this is I can't go farther than this, and both sides do that, then nothing's going to happen. There's going to be confrontation. So really, our indigenous communities, the developers, the miners, the energy folks also have to compromise. I think it's a negotiation, right? That's part of negotiation. We're dealing with that right now in the U.S. Our leaders don't want to negotiate, so we have our government is shut down. Nobody's talking, so nothing's happening, and I fear that could happen in these processes. So that goes back to my answer before about capacity, about resources, is that communities have to do it, right? I mean, there's no excuse anymore. And so, but a lot of times they don't have the resources or the or the language, or that goes back to capacity. And so whose responsibility is it to engage with
and I think,
those
when
individual
we
parts of
talk
the
about
community?
the idea of rights, right? So there are different perspectives of rights and rights obligations. So there's, some, we have communities that have matriarchal and patriarchal societies. We have elders councils. We have clan systems. We have house systems like they have in the Gitxsan. So when we talk about rights, we need to understand what that means when we're doing consultation with communities. And consultation implies sometimes that there's a requirement for compromise. And I think, when we have a clear understanding of what people's roles are in a community, we start to understand what the rights obligations are from a consultation standpoint. And I think when we talk about impacts, we need to really talk about impacts. Like, the big topic right now is data center. And I watched this 11-year-old kid do a podcast the other day, and he said, no one's thinking of me. We're building a data center in my town, and this data center, and he started doing the math, right? He started formulating the math of the value of water. And he said, we're in a drought, and we're in a water restriction from July until October. But yet we built a data center. So where's that water coming from for my kids? So when we talk about being informed, these are the things that proponents need to understand when we're talking about rights obligations. It's not about, the intrinsic rights of the people, but it's the rights that we feel obligated to as stewards of the land, as stewards of our family. When you hear an address, when people talk about our family, we acknowledge our kinship with the animals, the four-legged, the two-legged, the trees, because we have a harmony. I talked about cadence earlier. Cadence is about how living things, whether they're human or not human, there's a cadence that drives how we do things. And those rights obligations are much bigger that most people want to understand. I think that's probably the starting point when it talks to FPIC. What does that mean?
So I wasn't finished with my point, but so it goes back to me the leadership, right? What I'm saying is that, and I agree with what you're saying, Wayne, that as developers have to understand that and learn that and figure it out. But there's also a responsibility from our tribal, our indigenous leaders to be responsible for taking care of that engagement as well, right? If a developer comes to the front door and says, we want to start talking, we have to walk those folks through that process, but then we also as leaders have to be responsible for taking care of that engagement that in a transparent way with our own people, because a lot of times that doesn't happen, right? It goes to the leaders, to the elected officials that sign on the dotted line. But a lot of times that engagement's not happening with our community. In various degrees it's happening or not happening. And so as leaders, when we take that responsibility, we also take on that responsibility. And that's, like I said, that's the rub, is that if we don't have the resources to do it, we don't have the capacity, then it's going to fall through the cracks, and it's not going to be complete as it should be. So I just wanted to mention that.
Great. Thank you all for those great answers. I think just a lot of folks in the Q&A are asking about good examples, so maybe we'll turn to that last to end on a positive note. I'm just curious, you know, we've heard from Yadira and others that sort of there are a lot of challenges around this implementation still. Like, this is not a perfect system. We're not really all on the same page, perhaps using the same language, really even understanding each other at the end of the day. I'm curious, you know, how who's accountable? Are the mechanisms in place? What can we do to really ensure that there is accountability in FPIC? And I know a lot of standards and other frameworks talk about grievance mechanisms, but is that enough? Should the governments and companies and other actors be doing more? Where are we?
I'd say it depends on the where we're at, right? In terms of what locality, what jurisdiction are we in, the US, Canada, and other places. And so for most of these, right, with our Equitable Origin 100 certification, this is a lot of the work that we do is voluntary. So we've got actors, you know, companies that are trying to do the right thing. A lot of times they're still not 100%, but they're at least trying, right? Versus the rest of the industry that is not at the table, and then what the law says. And so depending on what country we're in, I mean, Adira made it in her opening, she talked about FPIC being part of the Constitution in her country, but it's not being implemented. They haven't made rules or regulations around it, and they probably won't, just because the companies have a big control there. But here in the U.S., FPIC UNDRIP wasn't passed by our Congress. We didn't sign it into law. So it's really a guideline versus the law, and so it goes back to what the law is, what the minimums are. Are we working with somebody that is wanting to do the right thing and is just maybe not there 100%? Because you go back to transparency and accountability. So how do we as like I said, how do we as Indigenous communities keep our leaders accountable? How do we keep them accountable to us, the people, versus how do we keep our partners potentially on the other side accountable to the agreements that they say, the things that they say they're going to do? And then what are standards, right? I mean, again, because a lot of these standards are voluntary, that's in there as well. But you're right. What are how do we? It is difficult because you know, we have 574 tribes, and the old saying is, if you know one tribe, you know one tribe. And so there are hundreds of ways to do this. So there's not one standard, there's not one template. I'd like to work on creating a template. That's a lot of the work that I'm trying to do, is standardize engagement, standardize the FPIC process, at least to a point, because we're all people at the end of the day. We're all humans, and our needs, we have all the basic needs, no matter where we come from. And so I think there's a foundation of what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. Beyond that, again, it depends on the locality.
Thank you, Daniel. Could Yadira wanted to add her thoughts, so let me just quickly pause for a translation of that as well. Yadira?
I just want to share an experience that we had a few days ago, precisely as a woman from the Kenya Association, from the Sikupai people, a minority nation. 1 week ago, we had a small meeting about FPIC. How can women exercise this right properly within our communities, with our communities in the Putumayo region, with the Center of Strengthening Indigenous Rights, CEPO? We had a series of meetings with the women. And unfortunately, none of the women in these communities of our nation knew what FPIC was. In this moment, there were a lot of questions from women. We asked them, have you heard about FPIC? And they said, nope, not at all. We don't know what that comes from. That's how we began as the Indigenous leader. How can we explain and translate and make people understand the importance of domestic, how youth, women, older people in our communities, why ethics is important? So basically, after many questions from the women, we decided to continue with other virtual sessions with real examples of ethics to build this capacity in women. And also, in Ecuador, currently, Indigenous people, we are being consulted, but not in, in but there's not a guarantee. It's just procedimental. It's a game, taken as a game, as a joke. Our indigenous territory are at stake because we have illegal mining going on. Even though they call it legal, it's illegal because they don't respect our territories, because it affects our territories. I was listening to Daniel. For us, water is also important. The jungle. That's where our spirits are, our spirits, our elders, who take care of us for over generations. If they destroy this space, the sacred space, they are destroying us. Even more if they destroy the Secopai forest, because we are a minority. We are just 1,500 people between Ecuador and Peru, so we cannot let this happen. It's our task. That's why I'm in this space. It's important for you to listen to the voice of indigenous people, because if you continue to destroy the, the home of indigenous people, then indigenous people are under threat of extinction. I want to really thank you for listening to me, and I can ensure that myself as an indigenous woman, I will keep talking to other indigenous women to ensure that the epic right is respected, because I believe it's a fundamental.
Thank you, Yadira. That was a great addition. I know we are very short on time, and I know we could have a lot of follow-up conversations about this. So I hope we can get everyone back together soon. I just want to ask one more question to the panel to end on a high note. So if you could be very brief, but what gives you hope right now?
What gives me hope, right? I'm biased, but like I said, I sit on the board of the Equitable Origin along with Yadira. What gives me hope is that there is industry that wants to do the right thing. They're volunteering to self-certify. It's a start. They're not being mandated to do it. So I think anytime we as humans can do things voluntarily without being forced to do something, I think that's a good thing. And so that gives me a lot of hope, is that there are we certify 15% approximately of the production of natural gas in the US and Canada. So we got 85% more to go, but that's really where I feel really positive, is that things are happening, and companies are doing the right thing, even without having to.
Thank you. Maybe Wayne, turn to you.
I have hope because I hear youth are expressing their voices, and they're doing that aligned with elders, and they're doing that with knowledge keepers, and so they're giving their message in parallel. They're working together. You know, our water keepers here in the Slavic country, one elder mentored her grandniece to kind of push that conversation. So I think for me, that's the hope. And the hope is that, you know, I'm seeing my kids made an observation when they were 8 and 9. They said, how come Indigenous kids walk with their heads down and non-Indigenous kids walk around with their heads up looking around? Well, my kids have made the observation now where there's more and more kids that are starting to look around, kick tires, walk through the bush, or ask questions. So that's my hope. That's where I get my hope.
Thank you, Wayne. Y finalmente, Yadira.
I have Many hope that indigenous people and nationalities of Ecuador and the youth, indigenous people, that we are proud to keep defending and protecting our waters, our culture, our jungle. I know there's good people in NGO sector, in the private sector, like the people at CEFO Indígena, that are helping us to build capacities about access to information, to be informed. And we also learn from our elders. We're also the same line to keep learning and to generate intergenerational learning on ethnic rights, but also in our culture. That's why I believe it's my responsibility to teach youth also about these things. As our elders say, when we do that, as we do things in a correct way, then the universe will also deploy itself in a correct way. So with those words, I say goodbye to everyone and thank you very much for having me.
I think this has been an extremely interesting session with 3 very unique perspectives, and I think I've learned a lot. I hope everyone else has taken a couple of key learnings away from today that will help us, co-create really meaningful FPIC processes in the work we're doing. And I hope, it's in a way that we all have a bit of patience and humility. These are really kind of complicated topics, and so, I would say if we didn't get to your questions, we'll try to send out a written response with our answers. I did want to leave everyone with some additional resources. So thank you again so much for joining us. Daniel, Wayne, Yadira, this has been an excellent discussion, and I hope we can continue it very soon. Thanks, everyone. Take care.